To be honest, I really hesitated when Ethan reached out to me. I had this vision in my mind of the kind of people who can do this kind of work, who can stand up here and talk about and express some of these big ideas. I mean, the incredible speakers that we've heard today, I think, are a testament. I never really saw myself doing something like that. It wasn't part of the image that I have of who I am. It wasn't part of the story that I tell about who I am. So as I reflected on this for a few days, I began to realize that's actually something I was interested in talking a little bit about, this realization that I had, that I am in large part a function of the story that I tell about myself. And we are the stories that we tell about ourselves. I think we've heard a lot about that today. How we inhabit our stories and how we inhabit the stories of the people in our lives that's part of our basic humanity. And how we understand those stories and how we live in them, that's important. In order to be ourselves, we have to be storytellers. And my view of storytelling has changed a great deal over the past few years. It's grown and become a lot richer. And I have the tabletop role-playing game Dungeons and Dragons to thank for that personal growth. For the past few years, my wife and I have been involved in an almost weekly game. We get together with friends. And of course, the most important piece of this is that we get together and have a lot of fun. That's a Manhattan up in the corner. So, for those of you who may be less familiar, Dungeons and Dragons is a game where a group of people get together and they pretend to be wizards and elves and dwarves and go on pretend adventures and do heroic things. It's a patently absurd thing for grown-ups to do. It's also, as I said, a lot of fun. So basically, you pretend to be in Lord of the Rings, and every once in a while, I'll talk to someone and they'll say, "So you pretend to fight monsters?" And I say, "Yeah, that's kind of basically it." But I began to realize that there was actually a lot more going on. Over time, over the course of a couple of years, I realized that the players in the game were using the game itself to express aspects of themselves that they couldn't normally do in their everyday lives. So let me tell you a little bit about some of this exploration. One of the players is a character named Cora. Cora actually found herself wrestling with complex issues of the interplay of life and death. Another character was this dwarf named Kundar, a very sort of good dwarf name. Kundar actually started life as this almost cartoonish, two-dimensional character named Thumper. Over the course of the game, Thumper actually acquired a name. There's a lot of sort of emotional weight in that kind of decision. And Kundar now actually deals with issues of duty and responsibility and family. There's another character named Wade. Wade has embraced this life of profound irresponsibility. Wade says and does silly and inappropriate things. This is very, very much in contrast with Wade's player. Wade's player has a very serious job, a very responsible job. So there's a freedom that comes in being Wade. Now, my wife's character, and I checked frequently before I wrote this part of the story, my wife's character is this elf archer named Mari. And Mari walks a path of moral ambiguity, to put it politely. Mari often says things that challenge ethical norms. Mari usually can be relied upon to do the right things, but it takes a lot of persuading. Now, my wife wears a lot of hats in her everyday life, and one of her hats is she's a clergy spouse. And in that particular role, people impose a great deal of their own expectations of propriety and decorum onto her. Gets comments about what she wears. I mean, she gets a lot more of this stuff than I do. I get away with a lot more, which I feel really bad about because she didn't exactly choose this the same way I did. So on Thursday nights, when Mari comes out, well, there's a little bit of freedom that comes with being Mari. And so pieces of her come out in this safe way. Now, for my part, I'm sort of everybody else. Dungeons & Dragons was created in the 1970s. My role is the Dungeon Master, a very 1970s term. So my job is to be the sort of overarching storyteller. I create the space, the environment, the adventures within which the characters and the players grow and make decisions. So I get to be the allies and the bystanders, the monsters and the villains. That's always a lot of fun. Now, in order to do that, I have to have a lot of control. In fact, I get to have an enormous amount of control over every aspect of everything that happens. I hold it all in my clutches. I do reflect periodically about what this says about me as a person. I leave that to your own judgment. So Dungeons & Dragons creates this way for us to tell a story and to inhabit that story in this vibrant way. One of the things which is really amazing about this is it's like a workshop for playing with thoughts and feelings and hopes and dreams and things that challenge us. Our characters can get away with things that we can't do, and we can have our characters do and say things that we would never do. And in those moments, we can experience an aspect of what it feels like to be in those moments. See here. So, the story is really at its best when we're challenged in this way, when we are forced to grow and to learn about who we are. And that's what these characters do. And that's actually when the game is at its best and really when the story is at its best. There's a way, actually, if you'll bear with me for a moment, that this is actually not completely unlike the work I do as a priest on Sunday morning. Now, obviously, the work that we do, though, in the services, the first part is really actually storytelling. We tell stories from the Old Testament, the New Testament, from the life of Jesus, what we call the Gospels in the Christian tradition. And not surprisingly, I find a lot of value in all these teachings, but at the same time, I recognize that they were written a long time ago in a different culture, in a different context. And so there's work that needs to be done in order for me to access the meaning. And one way that I do this is by imagining myself in the stories, to place myself as the characters and imagine what it feels like to walk in those stories and be in those stories. One of the sort of big air quotes I put around this character in some of these passages is the crowd. I find it very easy to locate myself in the crowd, because it's sort of a nameless group of people. I could be in that crowd. And when I imagine myself in those positions, the teachings, the passages, take on a very different meaning. So one sort of famous teaching, do unto others as you would have them do to you. It's a great teaching, just full stop. It's one we could organize our life around. But we tend to treat it as kind of a floating aphorism more than anything else. To me, it takes on a different meaning, a different weight, if it's actually directed to me. You do unto others as you would want them to do to you. So that changes things, and it forces me to reevaluate who I am. It forces me to challenge assumptions about who I am and how the world works. Sacred stories of all sorts of traditions really do this kind of work. I believe sacred stories of the Christian tradition do this work well. They challenge us to look at a world that's better than it is today, and to imagine ourselves in ways that are larger than we are, to be bigger and better than we could be, to grow, to imagine what we could be instead of what we are. There's one particular wrinkle within the Christian tradition I want to share a little bit with you today. There are 4 different versions of the Gospels. And each of them actually has their own perspective. Now, they all basically tell the same overarching story. They kind of get from A to B. But they actually have differences in terms of some of their details and nuance. In fact, sometimes they even disagree with each other. There's a couple of places where there's actually direct conflict in chronology. People sometimes scratch their heads a little bit when they think, oh, wait a second, they don't actually agree with each other. This really actually doesn't bother me at all. When they come into conflict, even when they betray a paradox, I think to myself, okay, there's no easy answer. In order to understand these stories, we have to go into them and be challenged by them. Now, the 4 Gospels all have these different perspectives. So the first one, usually attributed to the author Matthew, really conveys this sense that life is intended to have meaning and purpose, and that there's a sense of fulfillment to our lives. And the second one, Mark, has this powerful sense of urgency. Everything happens immediately. We're invited to ask questions about the importance of our decisions in the now, in the moment. The third one, Luke, looks at injustice in the world and asks us to consider a world where everyone receives the dignity and respect they deserve. And then the fourth one, John, asks us to transcend the world as we know it and to look at everything around us in new and different ways. 4 different stories, 4 different versions, all about one person. This makes an enormous amount of sense to me. How many versions do we have of our stories? How many versions do I have of my own story? I've got versions where I'm the hero, where I save the day, I do everything right, and I come home and cook dinner on top of it all. But I've got all these different versions and perspectives of my own story. In fact, I'm probably not even aware of all of the different versions and threads that I have. I do know that there are pieces of my story that I would really rather not dwell on. There's pieces that are painful or difficult, or episodes or relationships which are strained. But actually, I think it's the parts that are embarrassing that are the ones that I really least like to revisit. Who here really enjoys thinking about junior high school? There's just pain and anguish. Now, high school was also fairly challenging for me. There was a lot about high school which was great. All due respect to our recently graduated colleague who just spoke, but there's a lot about my experience that I would rather just pass by the wayside. Now, at the same time, high school is where I met the woman who would become my wife. Again, you can see all sorts of reasons why I might want to let go parts of my high school experience. So we'll let this slide pass on the wayside as well. So we have these different versions of our stories, and we approach them in different ways. So when people ask us questions about who we are, we have to ask, how do we answer? So a question I often get is, how did you become a priest? Particularly when I'm hanging out with other sort of gaming nerd folks, there aren't that many clergy running around, so I get the question a lot. So how did you become a priest? There's all kinds of ways to answer that question. I could tell stories about my experience at seminary in England. I've got great stories about England. I could talk about my father, who was a parish priest for 30 years. I could talk about the people who encouraged me along the way. Often I tell a story about a man I met about 16 years ago when I was a senior at Brown. And he came up to me and he saw me as a priest. He kept saying, "Oh, Father." I kept telling him I wasn't, but he refused to listen. He saw me as a priest. He saw something in me that I didn't yet see in myself. That's a story I often tell. I usually reflect on that story from the perspective of how he touched my life. But it's really only in preparing for this talk today that I stopped to think about how little I actually know about his story and how he ended up talking to me on that Saturday morning. He's a person like me. He had his hopes, he has his dreams, he has his moments of regret, his choices. I know almost nothing about them. I don't even know his name. And yet his story intersected with my story at a critical moment in my life. The simple act of telling a story invites us to be in a place and to imagine how we would respond, how we would feel. Telling a story asks us to grow as people, to stretch, to practice empathy. In part, I would suggest that it comes down to how we choose to engage with these stories. When someone tells us their story, do we listen? Or do we inhabit that story, to feel what they're feeling, to walk where they're walking? When we tell our own stories, which parts do we choose to lift up? Which parts do we allow to fade away? And why? Our histories don't have to completely define us. We tell our story through our histories, but we use that to point us in a direction to where we're going. People's stories matter. And how we approach those stories, how we live in those stories, that matters too. Thank you very much.